Ruth lived on the edge of Longhorn, Texas, a small, sleepy town where everyone knew everyone else's business and life moved at a slower pace. The air was dry and the wind carried dust through the streets, a reminder that life in the West was often harsh. Ruth had never imagined she would end up here, raising her children alone on a farm after her husband's sudden death. The farm, once a lively place full of hope and activity, had become quiet and lonely without the energy of her husband Samuel by her side. Samuel had passed away from a heart attack nearly a year ago, and since then, Ruth had done her best to keep things together, even though the weight of running the farm by herself was heavy. She wasn't new to hard work. Ruth had been raised in the countryside, where people had to rely on their own hands to get by. She had learned to drive the tractor, mend fences, and tend to the animals. But despite her experience, being alone on the farm with two young children felt like a constant uphill struggle. The crops weren't growing as they used to, and the old barn was falling apart piece by piece. Ruth had the strength, but the resources were limited, and no matter how much she worked, there never seemed to be enough hours in the day to make things right. Her children, Mark and Lily, were the lights of her life, but they were growing fast, and as much as they tried to help, they were still too young to take on the responsibilities of the farm. Ruth often wondered how long she could keep it up. She had no choice but to keep trying. The thought of leaving the farm, leaving her home, was more frightening than facing the challenges of keeping it alive. The idea of starting fresh in a new place seemed impossible. But as the days passed, Ruth found herself staring at the fields, wondering if it would ever get better. On the other side of town, Jack Evans lived a very different life, though not one that was any less lonely. His ranch was a large property that stretched out over acres of land, surrounded by miles of open country. Jack had inherited the ranch from his father, who had passed away years ago, leaving Jack to take care of the land and the cattle. Jack was in his mid-40s now, a man with a rugged, weathered appearance that matched the harshness of the environment he worked in. His face was tanned and rough from the sun, his hair a bit graying at the temples, and his hands were calloused from years of hard labor. Jack was a man of few words. He had always preferred the company of his cattle and horses to people. In fact, the only people who regularly visited him were the ranch hands who worked with him, and even then their conversations were brief and to the point. Jack had never been one for socializing, and after the death of his wife Emma a few years ago, he had become even more withdrawn. Emma had been the light of his life, the one person who had kept him grounded and helped him keep the ranch running. But when she passed away after a long illness, Jack found himself overwhelmed by the weight of the ranch and his own loneliness. In the years since her death, Jack had tried to continue the work, but it was hard to do it all alone. The land was large, and there was always something that needed fixing, something that needed attention. Jack had never been one to ask for help, but there were moments when he wished he had someone to share the burden with. He missed the companionship, the simple joy of sharing a meal with someone, talking about the day's events, and even the quiet moments spent sitting together on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the fields. As the months went by, Jack found himself feeling more and more isolated. The ranch had become a place of work rather than a home. The silence that filled the house was suffocating, and though he was proud of the work he had done, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was in one of these moments of solitude, when the sun had just dipped below the horizon and the evening air had turned cool, that Jack found himself wandering the edges of his property, staring out into the vast emptiness. The more he thought about it, the more Jack realized how badly he needed someone. He wasn't getting any younger, and the idea of spending the rest of his life in loneliness working the ranch with no one to share it with didn't sit well with him. But there was a problem. Jack wasn't the type to reach out. He wasn't comfortable asking for help or even expressing his need for companionship. His pride had always kept him self-sufficient, but he couldn't ignore the emptiness that had settled deep inside him. That's when he heard about Ruth. It was a hot summer afternoon when Jack first learned about Ruth's struggles. He had heard the town gossip, how she was doing everything she could to keep the farm running, how the crops weren't growing, and how she was finding it harder to keep the farm going without Samuel. Jack didn't know Ruth personally, but he had seen her around town. She was a strong woman, always busy, always focused. He admired her from afar. Ruth's story stuck with Jack, and over the next few days he found himself thinking about her more and more. He understood her struggle. After all, he had faced the same challenges on his own ranch. But he also knew that Ruth's farm was much smaller than his ranch, and her situation was even more precarious. The thought crossed his mind more than once that perhaps they could help each other. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack found himself on Ruth's porch, watching the last light of day fade away. It wasn't the first time he had thought about talking to her, but this time something was different. He had spent too many nights alone, and Ruth was in need of a way out of her struggle. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew that if he was ever going to break the silence between them, it had to be tonight. He walked up to her porch, knocked on the door, and when Ruth opened it, she was surprised to see him standing there. Jack looked at her with a mixture of determination and vulnerability in his eyes. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt a sense of urgency. Without wasting time, he said, "I need a wife tonight and you need a roof." The words hung in the air, as Ruth stood there unsure of how to respond. She wasn't sure if she should laugh or be offended, but there was something in Jack's voice, something raw and honest that made her pause. It wasn't a typical proposal, but there was no denying that both of them were in need of something they couldn't quite put into words. For a moment, they stood there in silence, each of them feeling the weight of the other's loneliness. Ruth's heart raced as she processed his words. She didn't know what to say, but deep down, she knew this was a conversation that could change everything. As Ruth stood in the doorway staring at Jack, the words he had just spoken seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken challenge. His offer was blunt, perhaps too direct, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. Ruth blinked, her mind racing to process what he had just said. "I need a wife tonight and you need a roof." The bluntness of it all was jarring, but there was something in the way he said it, something that told Ruth that Jack wasn't just offering a solution. He was laying bare his own loneliness, his own struggle. Ruth wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or make rash decisions. Her life had been built on caution, on thinking things through before acting. She had learned that the hard way. But in that moment, as she stood in front of Jack, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. It wasn't just physical fatigue from working on the ranch. It was a deeper kind of weariness, one that spoke of years of isolation, of living in silence, of doing everything by himself. Jack wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. Not really. She knew how hard ranching could be, especially alone. Ruth had her own farm to run, and though it was small compared to Jack's expansive ranch, the work was never ending. There were days when she wished she had someone to help her, someone who could shoulder some of the burden. And then, there were the long nights when the silence would creep in, and she would find herself longing for companionship, someone to talk to, someone to share the struggles with. But marriage? That was a much bigger decision. Ruth had been married once to Samuel, and though their time together had been filled with love, it had also been filled with challenges. Samuel's death had left a void in her life, one she wasn't sure she was ready to fill, and yet here was Jack, offering her a solution that was both practical and surprising. "I'm not sure I understand," Ruth finally said, her voice steady but cautious. "You want me to marry you? Tonight?" The idea sounded absurd, yet somehow it felt oddly practical too. Jack's ranch was a large piece of land. He needed someone to help manage it, someone who could keep things running smoothly. And Ruth had her own needs. Her farm was struggling, and her children's future depended on finding a way to keep it all together. "I know it sounds strange," Jack admitted, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he looked down at the ground, his voice softer now, less forceful. "But I'm not getting any younger, and this ranch isn't going to run itself. I've been doing this alone for too long, and it's wearing me down. You've got your own things to worry about, but I thought maybe we could help each other." Ruth took a step back, considering his words. She wasn't sure if he was simply desperate or if there was more to his offer. But as she looked at Jack, really looked at him, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't asking for love, at least not in the way most people thought of it. He was asking for partnership, for someone to stand beside him, to make the load a little lighter. "You don't even know me," Ruth said, a small frown creasing her brow. "How can you ask something like that?" Jack's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like guilt. "I know, I'm sorry. I don't mean to make it sound desperate, but I don't have time to waste. I'm not asking for..." Well, for anything complicated, just someone to help me on the ranch, someone who can be a part of this in whatever way that makes sense. I can't do it all by myself anymore. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She wasn't used to thinking in terms of practical solutions when it came to her personal life. Everything had always been about survival, about getting by. The idea of sharing her life with someone again, even in such an unconventional way, was unsettling. But the more Ruth thought about it, the more she realized that maybe Jack's offer wasn't so crazy after all. Ruth's children were growing older, but they were still so young. She couldn't run the farm on her own forever, especially with the kind of work it took to keep it going. And as much as she hated to admit it, the thought of a partnership, of having someone by her side to share the load, didn't seem as bad as it once had. After a few moments of silence, Ruth finally spoke, her voice softer now. "You're right. It's been hard doing it all alone. I've thought about what it would be like to have someone to share the responsibilities with. But marriage, it's not something I take lightly." Jack nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with. This is about survival, Ruth. About finding a way to make it through. It's not about love or romance. Not at first, at least. It's about two people coming together to help each other when the world feels too big to manage alone." Ruth looked down at the porch steps, thinking. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to help her so directly, without hesitation or pretense. Jack wasn't asking for anything beyond practicality, just someone who could help keep the ranch running, someone to be a companion in the most basic sense. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and in a world that often felt uncertain, real was better than nothing. "I'll need time to think about this," Ruth said finally, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "It's a big decision." Jack didn't push her. He just nodded, his face softening. "I understand. But just know that I'm here, if you decide this is something you want to consider." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them easing just slightly. Jack turned to leave, but then paused, glancing back at Ruth. "I'll be around, Ruth, whenever you're ready." Ruth watched him walk away, his silhouette growing smaller against the fading light. The evening air felt cooler now, and she closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she took a deep breath. Her mind was racing, the weight of Jack's words pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that something was shifting inside her. For the first time in a long while, Ruth felt like she had options. And maybe, just maybe, the choice wouldn't be so hard after all. The days that followed Ruth's conversation with Jack were filled with uncertainty. She couldn't stop thinking about the unexpected proposal he had made. At night, as she lay in bed, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She tossed and turned, unsure of what to make of it. On the one hand, it seemed like a practical solution to both her and Jack's problems. He needed help with the ranch, and she needed a way to keep her farm from falling apart. But on the other hand, it felt too sudden, too strange. They didn't even know each other well. Ruth had never imagined that her life would lead her to a situation like this, being asked to marry a man she barely knew, all for the sake of survival. Despite her doubts, Ruth knew that she couldn't ignore the reality of her situation. She was barely making ends meet on her farm, and the thought of her children growing up without any real security was a constant worry. The crops weren't growing like they used to, and the barn was in desperate need of repairs. Ruth wasn't afraid of hard work, but there were times when she felt as though she was fighting a battle she couldn't win on her own. As for Jack, Ruth had begun to realize just how much he was struggling too. The more she thought about it, the more she understood his position. He had taken on the responsibility of managing the ranch alone after his wife, Emma, passed away. Like Ruth, Jack was used to working by himself. But there was a difference between running a ranch and running a farm. A ranch was a much bigger operation. More animals, more land, more work. And from the way Jack spoke, it was clear he was exhausted. The quiet man who never asked for help had come to a point where he could no longer handle the weight of it all by himself. Ruth had been raised in a world where people took care of one another. Her parents had taught her that life was about giving and receiving help. And while she'd never imagined that help would come in the form of a marriage proposal from a near stranger, she couldn't deny that the offer was practical. The next day, Ruth made her decision. She didn't rush into it. Rather, she spent the morning quietly thinking about everything. She walked through the fields of her farm, letting the gentle breeze wash over her, The sound of the wind in the trees and the distant chirping of birds made her feel a little more at peace. She could still hear Jack's words echoing in her mind. I need a wife tonight and you need a roof. They weren't romantic words, but they were honest words. And in that moment, Ruth realized that maybe that was what she needed. Honesty. A partnership based on real needs, not on fairy tale fantasies. After considering all of this, Ruth went to the kitchen and began to prepare lunch. Her children were at school, and the house was quiet, giving her the space she needed to think clearly. As she chopped vegetables and stirred the soup, she thought about what life could be like with Jack. She wasn't expecting a fairy tale, but perhaps this could be the beginning of something that could work. That afternoon, Ruth went to the general store hoping to clear her head. She hadn't seen Jack since their conversation, and the thought of seeing him again made her nervous. What if she had made a mistake? What if this whole thing turned out to be a disaster? But as she walked into the store, she saw him standing by the counter looking like he'd been waiting for her. The sight of him, rugged and worn but with a quiet intensity, brought her back to the reality of her decision. Ruth. Jack greeted her, his voice warm, though there was a nervous edge to it. I was hoping I'd see you. Ruth smiled faintly, feeling a little embarrassed. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice steady but uncertain. I've thought about it a lot, actually, and I've decided I'm willing to give it a try. Jack's face softened, and for the first time, Ruth saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. He had been nervous too, but hearing her words seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. You sure? He asked, his tone gentle. Ruth nodded. I think this could work. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I can't ignore the reality of our situations. We both need help and we both need a change. So yes, I'm willing to give this a try. Jack smiled then, a small but genuine smile that made Ruth's heart flutter a little. It wasn't the kind of smile she had once imagined when thinking about love, but there was something comforting about it. It wasn't a smile of romantic love, but of understanding and acceptance. They both understood that this wasn't about grand gestures or idealistic notions. It was about two people who had spent too much time alone, each facing struggles that seemed impossible to overcome by themselves. Now they had a chance to face those struggles together. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Ruth began to gather her things, packing up what she could to bring with her to Jack's ranch. She spoke to her children about the move, explaining that it was a necessary change, and though they were hesitant at first, they eventually understood. Jack, too, was making arrangements on his end, getting the spare rooms ready and preparing the ranch for a new addition to his life. It wasn't a quick process, and both Ruth and Jack had moments of doubt, but they knew that there was no turning back now. One evening, as Ruth sat with her children, preparing their things for the move, she realized just how much of a leap she was taking. This wasn't just a physical move, it was an emotional one, too. She wasn't just leaving behind a house. She was leaving behind the life she had known. Her entire world was changing. But there was a sense of peace that came with that realization, too. She was no longer alone in this. She was walking toward something new, something that, while uncertain, held the potential to be better than what she had before. When the day came for them to leave, Ruth said goodbye to her farm with a mix of sadness and hope. She wasn't abandoning it. She was simply moving on to something different. Her children said goodbye to the place that had been their home, and though there was uncertainty in their eyes, they followed their mother without protest. Jack met them at the edge of his ranch, his eyes scanning the horizon as they approached. Ruth couldn't help but notice how different things looked now, how the land seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of them. This was Jack's world now, and soon it would be hers too. The first few days at the ranch were quiet but full of adjustment. Ruth helped Jack with the daily chores, getting a feel for the routines of his life. It wasn't easy. There was so much to learn, so much to do, but Ruth was determined to make it work. She had always been someone who took pride in hard work, and now that work was shared with Jack. There was a rhythm to the work, a quiet understanding between them as they worked side by side. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something solid, something real. Ruth knew that it would take time to build the kind of relationship that would make them truly partners in every sense of the word. But for now, the work was enough. For now, the shared purpose of surviving together was a good enough foundation. And so Ruth's new life began, not with a grand romance, but with two people coming together, imperfect but willing to try. The road ahead was unknown, but it was a road they would walk together, one step at a time. The days following Ruth's move to Jack's ranch were filled with a new rhythm, a new routine. Life on the ranch was different than life on her farm, and there were moments when Ruth felt overwhelmed by the changes. At first, it was the small things, the way Jack's house was laid out differently, the way the ranch's chores were arranged in a seemingly endless list. But as time went on, she began to adjust, and slowly, things started to feel more natural. Ruth quickly realized just how much work was involved in running a ranch, especially one as big as Jack's. The fields stretched far beyond what she could see from the porch, and there were cattle to tend to, fences to fix, and crops to manage. It wasn't easy, and at times Ruth's muscles ached from the labor. She was used to hard work, but this was a different kind of work, more demanding, more constant. She had to learn how Jack had run things over the years, how he managed the animals, the land, and everything else. The days were long, and the sun seemed to never set. But despite the exhaustion, Ruth felt a sense of accomplishment at the end of each day. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical work, about seeing the results of her labor at the end of the day. Whether it was a field that had been plowed or a fence that had been mended, the ranch was starting to feel more like home. At first, Ruth and Jack worked side by side in silence, each focused on their own tasks. There wasn't much conversation between them, but there didn't need to be. Ruth didn't mind the quiet. In fact, it felt comfortable, a peaceful break from the noise of her own thoughts. Jack, too, seemed content to work without much talking. It was clear that he wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone, and the adjustment was taking time for both of them. One afternoon, after a long day of sorting cattle, Ruth found herself sitting on the porch of Jack's house, watching the sun sink slowly behind the distant hills. The view was breathtaking, the sky painted with hues of orange, pink, and purple. As the cool evening breeze brushed against her skin, Ruth allowed herself a moment of peace. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this, how much she had missed the quiet of the countryside, the simplicity of nature. Jack came out to join her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He sat down next to her, but there was a slight hesitation in his movements. It was clear that he wasn't used to sitting still for long. Ruth noticed that he seemed more relaxed these days, but there was still something distant in his demeanor. He had his own way of coping with things, of keeping his emotions buried deep inside. "You ever stop to just look at the sky like this?" Ruth asked, her voice quiet but curious. Jack took a sip of his coffee, his gaze following hers. "Sometimes," he said, his voice gruff but thoughtful, "when the work's done and there's nothing left to do, I take a moment to look at the horizon. It helps me remember that there's more to life than just the ranch, but that doesn't happen often. The work never ends." Ruth nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It felt like there was always something that needed fixing, something that needed attention. But in moments like this, when everything was still and peaceful, she could almost forget about the constant pressure to keep things going. The sunset was a reminder that, for all the work and all the struggles, there was beauty in the world. For the next few weeks, Ruth continued to help Jack with the ranch. They had settled into a comfortable routine, working together without much talking. But slowly, the silence between them began to change. Ruth found herself asking Jack questions about the ranch, about his life, about his past. At first, Jack was reluctant to share much. He had never been one to talk about his emotions or his personal life. But Ruth's patience paid off, and over time, Jack began to open up little by little. One evening, after they had finished feeding the cattle, Ruth asked Jack about his wife, Emma. She had heard bits and pieces from the townspeople, but she wanted to hear it from Jack himself. She could see that Emma's memory still lingered in his heart, and Ruth wondered if he would ever be able to fully move on from her. Jack's expression softened as he looked out at the land. "Emma was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said quietly. "She kept me grounded, kept me from getting too lost in the work. We were partners, in every sense of the word. She helped me run the ranch, and we built a life together." He paused as if the words were difficult to say, but when she passed, it felt like I lost everything, I had this big ranch but no one to share it with. I didn't know how to move on. Ruth listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She could hear the pain in his voice even though he tried to mask it with his gruff exterior. It wasn't easy to lose someone you loved, especially when they had been such an important part of your life. Ruth knew that feeling all too well. Though her marriage to Samuel had been different in many ways, she too had experienced the emptiness that came with losing a partner. I get it, Ruth said softly. Losing someone you love is like losing a part of yourself, and it's not something you can just move on from, not easily. Jack looked over at her, his expression softening. I didn't expect you to understand, but I appreciate you saying that. It was the first time Jack had truly opened up to her about his past, and Ruth felt a sense of connection between them that hadn't been there before. She had always known that their marriage wasn't going to be a fairy tale, but now she understood that there was something deeper forming between them, something built on shared experience, on understanding the pain and loneliness that each of them had faced. As the weeks turned into months, Ruth and Jack's relationship began to evolve. They still worked together on the ranch side by side, but there were moments now when they would share a quiet conversation, moments when the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable but peaceful. Jack was beginning to trust her, and Ruth was beginning to feel that she could trust him too. The partnership that had started out of necessity was slowly turning into something more, a bond forged through shared work, mutual respect, and the understanding that they both had something to offer the other. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day's work, Ruth turned to Jack with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about the future? She asked, her voice tentative. Jack glanced at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? Do you ever think about what comes next? About where we're headed or what we'll do when we've finished all this work? Jack took a deep breath, his gaze settling on the horizon. I suppose I do. But for now, I'm just focused on today. On making sure the ranch keeps running and making sure you and your kids are settled. The future will take care of itself in time. Ruth nodded, her heart warming at his words. It wasn't the most romantic answer, but it was honest, and that was enough for her. For now, they were building something together, and that was enough to keep them moving forward, one day at a time. As time passed, Ruth and Jack found themselves settling into a life that neither had expected, but one that was starting to feel more like home with each passing day. The work on the ranch was constant, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as it once had. Ruth had come to appreciate the rhythm of the days, the way the sun rose early over the horizon and set gently behind the hills at night. She had learned how to care for the cattle, how to fix the fences, and how to work with the land in ways she never thought she could. Jack had become a partner she could rely on, no longer just someone she was working alongside for the sake of practicality, but someone whose presence was starting to mean something deeper. Though their marriage had begun with the practicalities of survival, it was beginning to take on a different shape. Ruth didn't expect grand declarations of love or perfect moments, but there were little things that started to happen. Small acts of kindness, moments of laughter, shared understanding, that told her this arrangement was something more than just two people coexisting. One afternoon, as Ruth was working in the garden near the house, she caught Jack standing by the porch watching her. She paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow, and met his gaze. There was something about the way he looked at her, soft, thoughtful, that made her heart skip a beat. She hadn't realized it at first, but over time, Ruth had come to appreciate not only Jack's work ethic but his quiet presence. His steady strength had become a source of comfort to her, and she felt safe with him. Need a hand? Jack asked, his voice low and calm. It wasn't a new question. It was one he asked often, but today it felt different. Ruth could sense that he wasn't just offering help with the work. It was a deeper question, one that spoke to the way they were starting to care for each other. I'm good for now, Ruth replied, smiling slightly, but thank you. Jack didn't say anything for a while, but as he stood there watching her, Ruth could see that there was a quiet contentment in his eyes. Over the past few months, he had started to open up more. He had told her about his wife, Emma, and the years they had spent together. Ruth understood that Jack's heart still carried the weight of that loss, but she also saw the change in him, how bit by bit, he was learning to let go of the past and embrace the future. The children had adjusted to life on the ranch, too. Mark, now 12, had taken to helping Jack with the cattle, and Lily, just a few years younger, had become quite the gardener. Ruth was proud of them. They had both grown stronger since moving to the ranch, and their bond with Jack had deepened. Jack, for his part, had become a mentor to them, teaching them the skills they needed to survive in the rural world they were now part of. It wasn't always easy, but Ruth could see the pride in Jack's eyes as he watched them work, just as she could see the growing affection in her children's eyes when they looked at him. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner in the rustic dining room, Ruth caught Jack looking at her again, his gaze softer than usual. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just gratitude or necessity anymore. It was something deeper, something she had come to recognize in the quiet moments when Jack would help her with the chores, or when they would sit together at the end of a long day, sipping coffee and watching the stars. "Thank you," Jack said quietly one night as they finished their meal. "For everything. You've done more for this place than you probably realize. I never expected any of this." Ruth looked up, surprised by his words. It wasn't like Jack to be so open about his feelings, but there was a sincerity in his voice that made her pause. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, her voice soft. "This wasn't just about me helping you. It's about us working together. We both needed something more than just surviving. And I think we found it." Jack nodded, his eyes searching hers. It wasn't easy for him to express his emotions, but Ruth could see the truth in his words. They had come together out of necessity, but over time they had built something stronger than just a partnership of convenience. They had created a bond based on respect, shared hard work, and an understanding of the loneliness that each of them had felt before they met. The seasons changed, as they always did. The summer heat faded into the cooler breezes of fall, and Ruth found herself looking forward to the future in a way she hadn't before. The uncertainty that had once filled her heart had been replaced by a quiet confidence. She had a place now, a real home, not just a piece of land she was trying to hold together. And more importantly, she had Jack by her side. One crisp autumn evening, Ruth and Jack stood together by the porch, looking out at the sprawling ranch. The sun had just set, painting the sky in shades of red and purple. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed perfect, when the weight of the world was momentarily forgotten, and the quiet of the land offered a kind of peace that Ruth hadn't experienced in a long time. "I never thought I'd be standing here like this," Jack said, his voice low but full of meaning. Ruth smiled, her heart warm. "Neither did I," she replied. "But I think we've both found something we didn't know we needed." Jack looked at her then, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "I don't know what the future holds, Ruth, but I know one thing for sure: we've got each other." Ruth nodded, her smile deepening. There was no grand promise, no perfect ending. But in that moment, standing there with Jack, Ruth knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey had been unexpected, filled with twists and turns, but it had led her to a place where she no longer felt alone. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living side by side, building a future together. The work wasn't always easy, and life wasn't always perfect. There were still challenges, still days when the weight of the ranch seemed too heavy. But Ruth knew that they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. And that in itself was enough. As they stood there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, Ruth felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that whatever came, they would face it together, and that was all she needed.